we'll have some time for you guys to ask them questions as well.
First, we'd like all of the panelists to say your name, your year, and your major. Or, yes.
You said name, year, major. My name is Shelton Rodriguez. I'm a junior at Kelvin University, and my majors are public health and global development.
Hi everyone, my name is Benjamin. I'm a sophomore here at Calvin. I'm studying political science and sociology.
My name is Isaac. I am a sophomore as well. I'm studying social work, African studies, and policy.
And my name is Nettie. I'm a sophomore here, and I'm studying chemical engineering and biochem.
Hi everyone, my name is Stacia Hoeksema, and I am actually a professor here. I teach in the sociology and social work department.
All right, so the way we'll do this is we'll ask them some questions, and then whoever feels like they want to answer can answer. And so we'll start off with the first question. How has transracial adoption played a role in your life?
Well, I'm adopted from Haiti, so it's played a pretty big role in that sense. Yeah.
Are we just gonna go down the line, or?
For this one.
Okay. Okay, so transracially adopted. I have two older sisters who are adopted from the Philippines. Myself and my brother are adopted from Korea. And then I have 7 younger siblings adopted from the American foster care system.
For me, I'm not transracially adopted. I have my little brother is adopted from the Eastern Caribbean, so that's my connection.
And then I was also transracially adopted. Me and my little sister were adopted from Ethiopia.
And I'm an adoptive mother. I have 2 biological children and then 2 girls who were adopted from the foster care system, and they are African American. So,
How has your racial identity development been affected by transracial adoption? How?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I remember this moment in my life where I was like 7 or 8, and it's kind of funny. But I remember looking in the mirror and just realizing I'm not white. My parents are white, but I look different. So it was always that kind of balance between, I had 2 white parents, so I'm never fully Asian in that sense, but I'm never fully going to identify with the white community as well. So that's kind of how it affected me.
Yeah, similarly, actually not similarly. My mother is Dutch, she's white, and then my dad is Puerto Rican. I'm Haitian, so my racial identity has been kind of confusing. I've been trying to figure out how I can connect to all these like different aspects of my familial connection. And so it's been difficult finding out like where I connect between my parents, between both the different cultures that my parents are a part of, but then also like my own culture, which is Haitian, or my own ethnicity, which is Haitian, and then even separated from that, the situation within the U.S. for Black people within the U.S. So there's like 4 different like spheres of connection that I'm trying to figure out and walk through.
Okay, so for me, it's pretty similar to Ben and Shelton. My parents are both white, so I always knew I was Black, so I never really had an identifier for like what that would mean for me. And I was also within like white environments a lot, so it was more like a self-education. I had to teach myself about like Black culture and then also Ethiopian culture and like how I would embrace both aspects.
Actually, it's okay if I answer this question too. So, I think that one of our errors is often to think that people of color are the only people who have racial identity work to do. And I would say that being an adoptive mom has put me in a space where I've actually had to do a lot of work around my whiteness. What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be a white mother of children of color? And that was work that I was already kind of doing, but I think that, and you may, Isaac, think have something to say about this too, is that so as a mother, right, thinking about the racial identity development of my kids has been, I think, a really important part of my responsibility as a mom. But that has been for my white kids as well as my African American kids. So trying to help them understand what does it mean to be white or African American in this multiracial space. So thinking about how do I intentionally expose them to different things, to different people, where are we going to live, where are we going to go to school, where are we going to go to church. All of those things are part of this racial identity development. And unfortunately, I think in transracial adoption, that's something that's not talked about enough. People aren't given enough information or tools or resources or even recognize like how important that is. So those are just some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, very similar experience. I grew up in a very white context, have a white mom and dad, and adopting my brother from the Eastern Caribbean. He's part Native, part African, and I think that experience of it's like you said, kind of bringing someone into your home that's coming from a different cultural context, that's coming from a different racial identity, kind of brings it all to home, right? And I think for me, like before we adopted my brother, I didn't really have to think about my racial identity, right? Because in the United States, if you're like a white identifying person, you don't necessarily have to go throughout your life thinking about your racial identity. And I think for me, that was just such a huge, and it's still something I'm wrestling with and thinking through. But having someone in your home as part of your family that sees the world differently than you, even as a 9-year-old, and experiences different things like microaggressions at school and racial stereotypes as a 9-year-old or as a kindergartner, I think those things just really bring it all home. And it's really hard to ignore that. Yeah.
Thank you all for your responses, and we'll be moving on to the next question. What were some struggles growing up as a transracial adoptee?
I think besides the obvious race difference, there's certain nuances within your cultural. So I mean, for the Black community, your haircut is such an important thing, and the way that your hair looks, the way that you present yourself for different cultures, it's just there's different levels of importance for the cultures that you're in. And so that hair, I'm looking back at these photos, I'm y'all let me walk around like this is unacceptable. What's going on? And so physical appearance was a struggle for me growing up in that context, but also knowing that that it wasn't an obligation, that I wasn't adopted out of obligatory need, and that it was genuine love. I think sometimes can be a struggle for adoptees. It can be hard for adoptees to talk back or really get in arguments with their parents because you already feel like you're being blessed in such a way for just being adopted, for having the opportunities that you currently have. And so it can be difficult to have those contentious arguments with your parents because you already feel like they're doing so much for you. So
just adding on to what you said, my 7 younger siblings are all African American, and my mom has gone to great extents at just learning on how to deal with hair, how to take care of it, maintain it, comb it out, braid it. And I think it really adds on to what you said, where it kind of adds to their identity. You're kind of forced into these situations that you've never been in and you never had the thought about growing up, right? So yeah, and then for me personally, a struggle was, where does my identity lie, right? There was days that I felt more white than Asian. There are days where, I go out and I'm with other Asian friends and it's like, I don't fit in. I don't understand what it means to have Asian family members. I don't understand all these little nuances in the Asian culture. But it's also the understanding that when I'm with white people in my community back home, I don't look like you. I'm a little bit different. I stand out. And growing up, that was a big struggle. And just finding out where does my citizenship lie? Who do I identify with? Yeah.
And 2, growing up with parents who didn't know how to do it. And that goes into nothing, again, my parents wanted to adopt and they adopted me and my little sister together. But they also we didn't really talk about race in the family because we were all trying to not notice the differences, I think, which didn't help with our racial identity growing up. So they're also conservative, or they were more conservative when we were adopted. So me learning about Black America and learning about the struggles within the Black community, I couldn't really bring that home to people who understood that. And broaching that conversation felt I don't know, not stigmatized necessarily, because I don't think my parents would have cared very much, or not cared, but they wouldn't have been against it. But me and my little sister kind of viewed ourselves as other, not just in our communities, but also in our families. So we would have those conversations together, but broaching those with our white sisters or our white parents felt not threatening, but something we were more scared of, especially when we were younger. So I think that really played a role.
For people who are not transracially adopted, what were some struggles that you faced?
So I think what comes to mind with this question is not focusing on necessarily the struggles that I faced, but kind of observing what my brother has gone through, and I've kind of spoken to that a little bit already. And not necessarily struggles, I'm the one suffering, because that's not the case here. But I would say challenges that I have faced have maybe been kind of just figuring out how to be the best person for my Black brother, right? And what does that look like as a white person? Because he knows I'm white and he knows he's Black. And that we're brothers and we hang out and stuff, but that's a very tangible divide, and it's a difference, right? And because of the culture that we live in, because of our cultural context, that in society, matters. That whole racial construct, even, comes into the family, similar to what kind of you were talking about. So I'd say a challenge that the biggest challenge that I faced has been kind of asking those questions of how can I best support my brother? And I still I'm still working through that. It's still very much a process, and me and my family, all are kind of asking those questions and figuring out what is the best way to raise a Black person in our family, right? And an entirely white family. Do we adopt again? Do we foster? Do we move? Do we switch churches? Do we go to different schools? And all of those questions are just so heavy. And I don't think there's a whole lot of great answers to those questions because of the structure of our society and how it all kind of has worked out. So yeah.
Oh, there's a lot of things to say. say here. The first thing that comes to mind is, similar to what's already been brought up here, and that's the whole hair and skincare piece. And y'all, that's real. And so I worked pretty hard at learning how to do African American girls' hair, and but then there's also the piece, and actually I'm struggling with that a little bit right now because my girls are teenagers and they're really needing to be responsible for their own appearance and hair. But there's a part of me, I know, and this is some of my own internalization stuff, that I feel like what their appearance looks like reflects on me as a white adoptive mom. So I'm always like, oh no, you get your hair in place because I don't want people thinking that I don't know what I'm, so there's this really interesting, like as you're trying to teach your kids to become more independent, and there's just like this different layer, I think, with the transracial adoption dynamic. Also, so something else I think from a parent perspective is the whole piece about needing a village, right? That it's okay and it's appropriate that I'm not the only person speaking into my girls' lives, even regarding things like hair care, skin care, and so forth. Yeah, I need to do the best that I can to learn what I can do, but also recognize that there's lots of resources around me that can also, supplement or do things that I can't do as their white mom, and that I need to be okay with that. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that I'm not a good mom or that I shouldn't be their mom or any of those kinds of things, but that's actually a part of my responsibility as a parent to figure out ways that they can have other connections with African American role models, other people who can speak into some of those areas. So those are some things that come to mind. I think also what you brought up about, like, how do you talk about race in your home, and that can be a struggle, right? Because it's like, on one hand, you don't want to overemphasize the difference, like you're different, but we're all a part of this family and an equal part of this family, but also the importance of making space for those conversations. And actually, I was talking to my girls this morning about that I was going to be on this panel, and I asked them what they were thinking, and one of my daughters said, I'm really thankful, and I think it's important that we talk about race, and we do in our family. Like, we talk about it very openly, and so often she said, like, if there's something going on in the world, she's like, Mom, you always ask me, like, what does that feel like from my perspective? And I don't know, for my daughter, she seems to appreciate that, but I feel like as a parent that it's kind of sometimes tricky to know how to live in that tension. So those are some things that come to mind.
Thank you. Next question. How has being transracially adopted or having someone close to you that identifies as transracially adopted changed your view of racism in society?
That's a very loaded question, and I think there's a lot of different avenues that you can go down to answer it. Racial reconciliation has different steps in it, and in each step, like, you have a different outlook for the people around you. For Black people, or for Black Americans, there's, in one of the steps, there is supposed to be, typically, there's a step in which, like, you actually have a dislike. It can be strong, or like there's a level to the strength, to the dislike of the oppressive group. So for Black people, it would be, for white people, there'd be a strong level of dislike. My mom's white, and so I definitely, when I was learning about racism, which is something I had to really learn for myself, I had to teach myself, I did find that like it was hard for me to. I didn't understand where I stood with my mom, because she's white and I'm black, and at that time I was going through my racial reconciliation process. I was going through the process of like understanding who I am as a black man within the United States, and how like this historical oppression, but like also continued oppression, is still impacting me now. And I was like, well, you're people, which is not necessarily true, but like, you know, because of her color, this is how I equated. I was like, your people like oppressed like my people, and because of it, I feel like I have to feel some sort of way. I eventually got to the point in the stages, you'll get to the point where you can have love for both, you know, you as yourself, and then the oppressive group. And so I got to the stage where I say, okay, I understand that, like, you know, you are my mother, you are white, and I am black, but I love you, despite our different color, which is really a concept that was, you know, created, and like past a certain point in history, like color, the whole concept of color is not really a thing, but it's something that we created as we came to the U.S. and as the U.S. Became colonized, and so yeah, like I was able to oversee this like concept, I guess, and just accept her for my mother, the person that who she is. But that's a very tricky question.
Yeah, for me, I think it definitely affected how I defined other, right? So I had Filipino, Korean, black, biracial, one white sibling, right? So kind of looking at the opposite side of racism, it was diversity. How do we define true diversity? It's not just numbers on a board, but it's an actual inclusion, right? And with a family, you have that inclusion, you have that love, you have that shared cultural bonds, right? I want to understand you and you want to understand me. It has to go beyond just that surface level relationships that oftentimes is just called diversity. But yeah.
For me, I think, I mentioned this before, but as a white identifying individual, I don't have to walk through society most of the time and think about my race. I don't have to think about that. I don't really have to think about my ethnic identity. I don't really have to think about my racial identity. And I think part of having someone in my house, having someone in my family who, like I said, you know, deals with those layers of oppression, that sort of systemic racism, has kind of made me realize over the past several years just how important racism is, and how it is maybe the most important thing, right? Like, it affects where we live, it affects where we go to school, where we eat, where we shop, all of these things. And as a white person, I would normally have to think about that, right? But I think having someone in my family, like, who I'm like, okay, should I take him to this part of town? Probably not, right? And I think just having that additional level of awareness, and like the gravity of it, right? And it's just like extremely important that we have these conversations, and that we act on these conversations.
Yeah, so kind of just adding on to what everyone else was saying, racism was always something that, like, as a black person, you're aware of. So that was something that me and Miki always had, like, Miki's my little sister, sorry, always had, like, a context for, and we're interested in learning about because it affected us. And then I think for, like, my sisters and my parents, that's not something that they had to think of. And I think it makes you think more about how education plays such a big role. Like, I would look things up, I would learn things in school, and then I'd tell my parents about it, and they'd be like, wait, why did me and my education in, like, the 70s and 80s, like, I never knew that this was a thing. And they never looked into it because why would they? It didn't affect them. So, like, not just interest, but also, like, looking deeper into like the history of the U.S. makes you understand racism a lot more. And then like being a white person and actually being interested in learning about those topics.
So I'm gonna actually go to a little different space than, thank you all for those insights, but it makes me think about actually the reasons why I need to be involved with like anti-racism and systemic change, right? So it's one thing to have a multiracial, multicultural family, but when we really, start to understand racism, the historical context, all of those kinds of things, being in, having my girls, already I think that it's a part of my call as a Christ follower to do this, but now as a mom of Black kids, like I have no choice. I must be in this fight, in this work, and continue to do that. And so that means putting myself in spaces where maybe I'm uncomfortable or there's conflict that I don't really want to have. But if I'm going to be an advocate for my children, I must go into those spaces. I think the other thing that is worth noting, and this is actually kind of an uncomfortable part of this conversation about transracial adoption, is that actually a lot of transracial adoption is connected to racism. And if we're not honest about that, right, about our system, the way that I'm a social worker, so I'll just be critical of my own profession, right? That there's a huge disproportionate number of Black and brown children that get removed, that get put in the foster care system, these kinds of things. And I think when we're talking about transracial adoption, we have to acknowledge that that is a part of this picture. That does not mean that there's not beauty. I'm a huge proponent of transracial adoption, right? But because there's beauty in the what happens in adoption, we can't negate the fact that in order for that to even happen, there was some pain or some brokenness, right? Whatever that story is, and there's lots of different stories with that. But just recognizing that while God can make something beautiful, it also means that there was pain and there was brokenness at some point in the story. And if we just ignore that, I think we're doing a pretty big disservice to the full picture of transracial adoption. So just...
what are some things to keep in mind when you're adopting transracially?
The crazy thing is, I actually helped come up with these questions. And so, like, I feel like I should know how to answer them, but, like, as I'm sitting here right now, I'm like, bro, what? I think authenticity, bring your genuine self. When you have a child, or, like, when you have somebody in your life for such a long period of time that you will have your adopted child for, like, they will notice if you're not being real, if you're uncomfortable. Like, they'll start to pick up on those things as you interact with people, especially for a duration of time that you would your child for. Like, they will notice your uncomfortability. And so I think just being open and honest from the beginning, being able to express your feelings about things that make you uncomfortable, having those conversations, I think that would be something to keep in mind, because nobody wants to be in a home where you don't feel necessarily comfortable and or unconditionally wanted in. What is this unconditional? Like, we're not unconditional people, only God is, but when you have a child, you gotta try your best to be able to portray that for their sake and also for yours.
Yeah, I think that goes to both ends, right? Just as I've grown older, it's kind of looking at all the sacrifices my parents have done, right? And it's kind of easier just to talk about my position and how I've seen things. But definitely not till recently, I realized how hard it must have been for them. It's parenting and finding out, how do I engage with my child's culture? How do I be inclusive? How do I figure these things out? So I'm just really glad and so grateful for my parents that they actually had this interest and desire to kind of dig deep and kind of make me feel like part of a family. All of my siblings, we all come from different backgrounds, but we're all part of one family. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, so I think coming at this term like a white person's perspective, I think if you are in a family that's thinking about adopting internationally, transracially, or if you're someone who's thinking about that, I think kind of going to your point earlier, it is your responsibility to read lots of books, to get involved with social issues in the community pertaining to race, to go into those uncomfortable contexts where you're the cultural, ethnic, and racial minority. And I just think it's so important. Like, it is, I like you said, like Christian calling, like that for me, like that's also a motivation of, it's justice, right? But I think also, if you have someone in your family, it's like even more your responsibility. And I think like those things are not optional, shouldn't be optional for anyone, but especially for white families who are adopting transracially. It's very important.
Yeah, just to reiterate, basically, like, education is key when you're transracially adopting. Whether it's international or domestic, I think you should always learn about your child's culture before and during your adoption. And then also, like, recently this is probably always an option for us, but we've really created like a safe space in the house to talk about racism, to talk about where we come from. We went back to Ethiopia like 2 years ago now, I'm pretty sure. And that really just opened up more conversations about who me and my little sister are, our ethnic identity, and also our connections to not only our immediate family, but to our birth family. So I think all of that is really essential in creating like a safe and nurturing environment for the children and just the entire family.
So I think what I'd like to add to what's already been said is to try to avoid the like white savior phenomena. I think that's really hard with transracial adoption. You get a lot of affirmation from the general public. It's like, oh, that's so great. You're so great. You're like angels. That kind of stuff. And just really being able to say, no, that's not what this is about, right? And I think it's important for adoptive families to know that this is difficult, right? I'm not gonna just sit up here and act like everything is great. We have seriously like trauma and adolescents meeting themselves in our home right now. And it is hard every day. And I know that God called me to this, so that's what I hang on to. But the reality is that a lot of kids from, lots of different adoptive experiences have trauma. And there's a lot of pain. And as a parent, it's not just about like, oh, I have these cute brown kids, right? Like, am I committing, am I willing to walk with them through all of whatever it is that is their story? And that has to do with their race identity development, but it also has to do with a lot of other stuff just connected to adoption, right? And so I think that if you're going to be an adoptive parent, you have to be willing to make those those decisions, those sacrifices. You have to be able to say there's certain places that I'm not going to go anymore or be a part of anymore because that's not the best place for all of my children. And I think what you said too, I think that how do I intentionally create spaces where I go, where they are the majority and I am the minority? That doesn't just happen. That stuff doesn't just happen. You have to seek that out. You have to be intentional. You have to be very thoughtful about how doing that. And I feel like sometimes I've gotten that right, and sometimes I get it wrong. So then let me just say that last thing. There needs to be a lot of grace flowing in all the different directions. So that's another part of transracial adoption.
As a transracial adoptee, what are you grateful for about your upbringing as a transracial adoptee? What do you wish was different? Oh, so I think we'll just move on to the next question since they kind of answered that already. But what are some questions you want to ask your guardian in regards to the adoption process?
I feel like maybe, I don't know, let me not generalize this to everybody, but I think a question that some adoptees may have is like the why me. For my circumstances, I know, so it's not necessarily the question that I have. I'm not sure I have any questions. Maybe, like, given what you know now, like given the experiences that you've had now, given the struggles that you've gone through in adopting me, but also like the positives that you've had in adopting me. Like, if we went back in time, you know what I'm saying, would you do it again? I'm pretty sure the answer would be yes. But yeah, that would be a question that I'd have.
I think it's hard to pinpoint it to one question and one definite answer. I think just growing up, there was a lingering question of like, am I still loved even though I look different, even though I don't share your same skin color? I think that question is answered through a long process of time, through a lot of actions through my parents and through my siblings. It's intentional, right? So I couldn't really pinpoint it to a question and be like, hey dad, this or that, you know. I think there's a lot of lingering questions that are just answered as you grow up, as you build those connections with your parents.
Going last, so I should have thought of an answer. But again, I don't really have a lot of questions. You can't really hide adoption when you're transracially adopted, so that's always been a thing that we've openly talked about. I don't know if. So yeah, I think I'm good.
So if you guys have any questions like out there, you can text this number. It's kind of so way like we can filter the questions and make sure they're not too long. So if you have any questions, you can text this, and yeah. But if you don't, we'll give you guys a second.
Is anybody in the audience adopted? No. Oh, okay. I don't like awkward silence.
We'll ask them. We can ask them. I mean, really, like maybe some people in the, I mean, were there things that folks said that you really resonated with, or did you wonder about?
This question asks, how did educating yourself about racism affect your mental health growing up?
Great question.
For me, educating myself really meant, well, for my mental health, it empowered me, actually. So going into, I want to say, freshman year, I joined the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that was a very beneficial thing for me to do. I don't necessarily support like all their political ideas, but to be surrounded by educators, people who are educating themselves in what it means to be Black in the U.S., like that was great for me. And yeah, like, it was good for my mental health to educate myself.
Yeah, I think for just educating on racism and everything like that, for me it was more of an identity problem about like where do I align with my identity and who I am. But I'll be honest, it wasn't like a drastic impact on my mental health as well. And I want to be honest about that. I think that you can wrestle with some of these questions and it'd be a really beneficial thing, like Shelton was saying. So thank you.
I'm gonna go the opposite direction with it, I think. Like I can remember being in like 5th grade, middle school, learning about like slavery, learning about like Emmett Till, learning about these like really traumatic experiences in African American history, and being like the only Black kid in class. So you were feeling that trauma in a way that no one else in the classroom was. So you had to kind of internalize it in a way that no one else did. So I think it took a while for me to understand how to properly process those events. And then in the same context of like last summer when it was all in the news, and then you're learning about like trauma after trauma after trauma, I think it's harder for, well, definitely harder for like Black people to navigate those. So you have to be able to understand yourself mentally when you need to check in, and when you also need to take like just a mental breather from always learning.
Another question is, did any of you go through counseling, either family or individual?
Dang, that's a personal question. I did. I went through counseling, but that's because like, I'm not necessarily sure it was because I was adopted, but I had the situation coming from Haiti to the U.S. And I only did counseling for a little bit, but yeah, I did.
I actually didn't, and we also didn't do family counseling, but looking back, I think I really wish we had, because those are a lot of like experiences and emotions that, like I was 6, my little sister was 3 when we were adopted. As a child, you can't process all of that. And as a family, you can't really verbalize what everyone is going through very well. And I think having that like intentional environment would be really important to any adoptive situation.
We do all the counseling. When we first adopted our girls, we went through a program called the ADOPTES program, and that was, our girls were 2 and 4 when we adopted them. And our 2-year-old was too young, but our 4-year-old participated in it. It was a program that, you know, the kids met in one room and the parents met in another. That was very helpful for us. And then we've just kind of had ongoing, I see a lot of social workers, okay, in my spare time. And again, I think maybe this is similar to what Shelton alluded to. Maybe some, I mean, I'm sure a portion of it is related to adoption and race identity development. That's another layer. But for us, a lot of it has been around trauma. So.
As it, oh, you got it.
Bouncing off of that, my brother's done lots of counseling too. And I think just like kind of emphasizing that point of there's lots of trauma involved in these situations, right? And from what I've observed, I've known like quite a few families who have transracially adopted, and counseling and acknowledging that trauma is always helpful, and it always ends up better. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, as a transracial adoptee or close family member, would you consider adopting transracially or otherwise in your future families?
Yes, I would, but like everybody has said thus far, like I'd have to do a lot of education. I think being able to share yourself with other people, being able to, yeah, that's a good way to like love, right? And that's how you can spread like God's love, the love that He wants us to spread to other people, is by sharing ourselves. And I think adoption is a beautiful way to do that, because there are people that are in situations which they would benefit better if they're out of those situations. Like I was one of those people. And if you have the means to do so, you should definitely do it. But make sure that you educate yourself before. Because you don't want to take somebody out of a bad situation into another bad situation. Like, that's not fun. So I would, yes.
Yeah, just echoing what Shelton said, I think that adoption and foster care in general is a high calling, but it's not a calling for everyone.
Yeah.
There are many challenges that are ingrained into that process, and it sounds nice just to have that mindset of like, oh, I'm gonna go adopt a child and like, lucky me, all this stuff. But it's actually a decision that should take effort. It should take time and really diving deep in, why do I want to do this? Why am I being called to do this? But yeah.
I think yes, but with lots of caveats of like educating yourself, making really like difficult life decisions that may put myself in a difficult situation, but it's for the betterment of the child that I would be adopting. And just being, like you said, like, what are my intentions in doing this? We've talked about like the white savior complex, so like, and if you're prepared, right? If you really have to be honest with yourself. I heard a story, I think it was 2 years ago. There was a couple that went to China and like went through the whole adoption thing, like did all the paperwork, all the home studies, all of the things. Got matched with this little girl who was special needs. Went to China to pick her up and decided that they didn't want to do it anymore because it was too hard. And just kind of going off of, I think either Shelton or Ben said, like, you just got to make sure that you're prepared for that. And that you are honest with yourself, because you don't want to be putting someone that's in a bad situation in a bad situation or in a worse situation.
Yeah, basically just reiterating, I think it's important to analyze why you're doing a transracial adoption, or like for me, why you're doing an international adoption. Especially if it's a white family, I don't know if the caveat of it being transracial needs to be your priority. I don't think that you need to, like we were saying transracial because all of us are transracial and that's what we've experienced. But a white family can adopt a white child, and a black family can adopt a black child. I don't think that there's one mold for what adoption can be, and I don't think we think about that as often as we should, because you see a white kid with a white family and you never question that. and you see a white kid with a black family, and you might also not think that that is an adoptive environment. So I think we all have a specific stereotype of what we're thinking, and like that's another thing that needs to be analyzed.
I want to add, I am not having any more kids, so no, I will not be adopting again. I mean, unless God does something really miraculous. But I guess I want to piggyback. This made me think of something for families who maybe have a heart for adoption, but don't necessarily think that's what they're being called to, or think they can do it, those kinds of things. I just want to say there's a lot of opportunities. I talked earlier about community, right? And I mean, honestly, like providing respite care for adoptive families or families that are doing foster care, or supporting them, or being like a mentor to, you know, someone in your church or in your school community or something like that. Like, there's ways to be a part of this story without being actually an adoptive parent yourself. And I as an adoptive parent, I wish there were more people who were saying, you know, how can we come alongside you in helping you raise these children? So just a little bit about that.
If I can add on to that, I think that I don't want to dissuade anyone from adoption. I think that there should be a more emphasis in the Christian circles for adoption and foster care. I think that should be very key in our Christian journey. But there are concerns, and there's going to be hardships in that journey. It's not all just, you know, rainbows and butterflies. And like what you were saying, Professor, I was really adopted in two senses. I was adopted by my parents, and then I was adopted by my church community. I can't tell you how many meals we had, how many people were offering to come over and help babysit, help around the house. Even with my 7 younger siblings, they all came in a sibling group of 4 and then 5, right? So we had many frozen lasagnas, many soups, everything like that. So if you're like, you know what, I do feel a calling in this. I feel like God is calling me to this, but I don't know if it is directly fostering someone or directly adopting a child. Look around you, look in your community, see who is really needing in that community. I think that's key, but yeah.
Okay. When meeting someone new, would you rather them get to know you as an individual first, or as being transracially adopted? I think it's kind of just like an identity question, so.
I mean, I am transracially adopted, so like if it comes up, it comes up. But like I would like them to know me as me. But me as me is transracially adopted, so it'll probably come up. You know, like, yeah.
I think Sheldon said that perfectly. There are many aspects that make me me. One of them is being adopted. You can't hide that, you know, and it's just there. But I would like someone to know more than just, oh yeah, that's Ben and he was transracially adopted, right? But yeah.
Yeah, basically, like, I'm not shaking hands with people and being like, hi, I have white parents. But it is like a part of who I am, so yeah, just what they said.
This is the last question. Has there been good or hard conversations within your adopted extended family as a result of your adoption?
Yeah. Yeah, there have been some hard conversations with the family. Different political views, different ideologies, like all those things have to be addressed because you are family and you care about each of the members within the family, even the extended family. And so like you will have like those hard conversations, and like especially when you get older and you like start to understand what's going on, because when you're younger it's like, okay, like I'm gonna just do this, that, or whatever. But when you can actually start engaging in intellectual conversations with your grandparents or your aunt and uncles, then yeah, it does get
for sure. I think I'm very grateful for my extended family because I never felt like I wasn't part of that family unit. I never felt different for them. They always treated me and my siblings above and beyond. So I'm so grateful for all of my extended family in that aspect.
I think part of transracially adopting or adopting at all, you're gonna have those difficult conversations. Because ultimately we live in a broken world, and in a perfect world, like, we wouldn't have to have adoption because all families would be whole and amazing. So yeah, difficult, like, even my little brother, who is 9 years old, has started, when he like gets mad or frustrated about something, he'll just say to us, "I want to go home." And he doesn't mean to our house, he means back to Dominica, where he's from. And that's difficult, you know? And I think, like, kind of going back to, like, considering transracially adopting or internationally adopting, these conversations are gonna, like, they're really hard, and there's not a whole lot of cut and dry, like, good answers either. You just kind of have to wrestle with it, which is good, because, there's suffering in the world, and, like, yeah, I think, we talked about being as Christians, like, kind of feeling that, but it's really hard.
Yeah, just going back to like the extended family part, I think me specifically, I come from, my extended family is very like conservative, and I'm not saying I was like radicalized in high school, but I do not agree with any of their like political leanings, and so I think that like a part of my race identity plays a big role in my political leanings. So some of those conversations I think are almost better left not had, because that's gonna just create a type of tension and a boundary that I would prefer not to have with my extended family, especially because they live in like Iowa and Kansas. So I want to have fun times at Thanksgiving and not those conversations.
That's a fair point, right? I mean, in some ways, I feel like you need to pick and choose when and where and with whom you're going to engage in some of those spaces. But I think to live authentically, there are going to be spaces and times where you have to have those tough discussions with extended family. Interestingly, my husband's family actually also adopted transracially, so this is like a second generation. So that's been kind of an interesting dynamic with extended family, right? To see the ways that there's similarities and differences in our experience, and even for my husband having a sibling who was adopted, who struggled actually quite a lot, and the way that my husband dealt with that, thinking about how does that come through in similar or different ways as a father. So there's just a lot of layers, right? And I think, for example, last summer was really tricky for a lot of families, particularly adoptive families, where they felt like extended. I didn't so much have that experience personally, but a lot of extended families or people who were adoptive parents felt really disappointed and disconnected from their families of origin because they felt like they were not considering the impact of all of that upon their adopted child. And I had lots of conversations about just the tension in families around some of that trauma that was happening last summer.
So at this time, we will be closing out our session. So I want to thank you guys for coming out and listening and being attentive to our speakers. And I also want to thank our speakers for being willing to share and be vulnerable with us. And so with that, you are free to leave. Thank you.